talk about today is talking about some calls to action. It's mainly focused towards grant operators themselves, but this isn't something that exclusively applies and should only be heard by grant operators. I think that anyone who interacts with grant programs, whether you're a grantee, whether you're a friend of people building a program, whether you're actually employed to build a program and you are quite you have a fiduciary responsibility to run this kind of program well. I think it's going to touch on a number of points that I'm sure we'll be hearing throughout the day in many different contexts, but it's also important to bring up and kind of speak about publicly and raise these kind of questions to make sure they're top of mind in the context of these kind of programs. Before I jump into it, just a quick introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Eugene. I'm currently the executive director of MetaGov, which is a governance research nonprofit. In addition to overseeing the organization overall, I'm leading a small research group called the Grant Innovation Lab team, where we released a report last year called The State of Web3 Grants. We're going to release another version of that report later this year in September. That will include, between last year's and this year's version, we will have covered roughly 30 different programs, grant programs in the Web3 space, and doing kind of qualitative reviews of these programs to really highlight what are they about, what's their publicly stated mission statement if they have one, what's the operations like, processes, review structures, etc. We hope that these kind of resources help just kind of set some common understanding and can help us have more kind of deeper and more intelligent conversations along these lines. And for anyone who's just coming in, if you missed the Coach Jay's talk on the Gitcoin side, the canvas that they produced and many other tools and resources coming up in the public good space, it's just super exciting to see the overall maturation of this space and so many different contributors and players kind of finding different ways to chime in and overall sort of grow the pie, which might be its own kind of regen project in that direction. But some of the specific things that I want to bring up today, it starts with really thinking about theories of change. For those who are just here for the last session, that initial plan portion of like thinking through and organizing your thoughts around what you're trying to accomplish with your grant program. Want to touch a little bit around this concept of theories of change and how it can actually help go beyond some initial outputs and metrics that I think are a lot of the low hanging fruit that we initially go for. I also want to highlight the element of being comfortable calling grant programs what they really are, and recognizing that there's a lot of different grant mechanisms, and you can use them in different kind of ways to different kind of ends. But at the end of the day, just calling everything under one umbrella term, whether it's like everything is a grant program, well, it's not. It's a specific type of allocation mechanism, and it's a specific subset. And everything isn't impact. And there's outcomes, outputs, and then there's impact. And creating more nuance around these things. I know it's hard to like market in 3-word taglines, but it is really important to have these deeper discussions to make sure we know what we're trying to get at. And thinking about feedback loops, support structures, thinking about how do we actually make public goods sustainable, because I know public goods is itself a term that gets slung around a lot by grant programs, and then once you start really double clicking on that, you recognize they're really focused on network goods that really only exist in their ecosystem. And it's not to say that that's wrong, but again, it's just about like being more nuanced with what we're trying to accomplish and thinking about how if we as a Web3 space really want to think about long-term adoption, long-term impact to humanity, we really need to be thinking beyond, how do we get our product to grow? Like what's the next step beyond that? What is this actually going to change in the world on a multi-decade scale? And how do we start planning for these kinds of things and getting feedback from the people we want to eventually be affecting? Yeah, and the last bit is around sharing and coordinating more, which I think got brought up by both speakers ready today. But yeah, it's still something that there are a lot of challenges with, and I'll be happy to share more specific stories of challenges when not in a recorded medium. But the first thing I really want to start with is this idea of defining desired impact. And there's a lot of different resources online. There's this group called SOPAC. They have some great visualizations and examples to run you through it. And this is by no means a deep lecture on what theories of change are. It's like its own body of literature there. But basically, you want to think about, from the program evaluation framework, there's a simple of you have resources, you fund activities as a result. Those activities have outcomes, those activities have outputs, which produce outcomes, and eventually that leads to impact. And when you actually run this through this bigger wrapper of, what is our ultimate vision? What is the thing we want to change in the world? And you start developing and backing into the process of how you then execute that change in the world. This comes down to this idea of theories of change. And so I figured SOPAC had another example here that I figured I would just borrow here because it's very not rooted in Web3. And of course, there's going to be some obvious difficult parallels of bridging into this, right? But it's this idea of presenting half problem statement, half pointing at the solution, right? The idea of young girls age 15, 16, and 17 are at an increased risk of human trafficking as a result of a lack of education opportunities, or excuse me, lack of opportunities to get education and thereby jobs, right? So you're already presenting what is the change you want to see in the world. You want to see less teenage girls involved in sex trafficking, and you start alluding to a specific solution that you want to approach to make that happen, right? You want to focus on the job opportunity and availability of those kind of opportunity perspective there, right? How does that bridge to? I know someone I think brought up like Arbitrum and users, right? Like the idea of like users and TVL growth and all these on-chain metrics is usually the kind of impact that's talked about. And I really love arguing that like that's just not impact. That is an outcome. Like these are the early stage things. What happens if you get that TVL growth? What happens if you acquire the amount of users that you want, right? What happens if the whole world is using your product and tool? Right, just saying that like that's the end goal seems self-serving, right? And I know in talking to a lot of individuals, that's not the actual ethos of why we're in this space, right? We want to recreate, whether it's economy, society, create new models for humanity. Like there's a lot of wonderful ambition in this space, and I think trying to actually concretize it a bit and say that like we don't all have to change everything all at once, and we can start picking and choosing of which products, which tools, which foundations. What's the thing you want to fight for? And that's actually going to help you get a lot of clarity over where to prioritize your own resources and your own disambiguation from every other protocol that's also rushing to just get more users and more TVL and etc. And so I think that, and I'm very hopeful that in this next 12 to 24 months, that there is going to be a lot more drilling down into what is the thing that we want. Because I know just from 12 months ago, the amount of times that I hear the word impact come out as a top three problem for any grant operator, it's very steadily increasing up. And so I think we're just naturally getting to this point where, well, if we're all shooting for the end impact of me have more users than you, right, that's going to be a very zero sum game. And supposedly we're all here to avoid zero sum traps and create new abundance mindsets and things where we can all thrive together. So I think actually clarifying these things will make it easier to support collaboration and more sharing, because then we're not going to feel like we're just competing for the same user set, but we're going to say that, hey, our users hopefully will have more focus on regeneration and natural environments. For some users will focus on job growth or education growth or financial literacy or any other kind of larger impacts beyond. And I guess on this note, and just really to summarize, because I forgot to add a separate slide for this one, but the idea of really refining your own impact, right? It's again, what are you trying to do when you actually get those users? And it's okay to evolve that over time. You publicly stating that you hope that, more users of your tool equals more financial inclusion in a specific part of the world, no one's going to legally hold your feet to the fire on that, right? It's okay to be public, to change your mind, to realize you were too ambitious, not ambitious enough. We also need to be more comfortable failing publicly, which inherently entails having more humility. None of us know what we're really doing at the end of the day. We're all just doing our best approximation, and that's okay to say. We're all figuring it out, right? I always like to think that everyone here is are highly ambitious individuals trying to work on something. In my mind, ambition inherently means you are out of your depth, right? You are trying to do something you have not done before and potentially has not been done before. That means you have to be comfortable saying that, like, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm trying to bring together the right set of people to accomplish these goals and to push each other in a healthy and productive way so that we can do more together. I also think this comes down to the question also of right, calling grant programs what they are. I'm sure if we go around and maybe stop recording for a bit, we can find a number of examples where groups have shipped tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and roughly could have just set it on fire in someone's backyard, and it would have had roughly the same end goal or same end output, right? And that was definitely not the goal, right? Groups were hoping to do something with it. But at the end of the day, when you pretend that what is really a marketing campaign is not, and you're calling it a grant program or doing these deeper things, you're actually confusing your team internally. Because what you're pushing them towards is like, hey, I want marketing outputs, I want these numbers, I need these things happening on a very short term basis, but cloak it under this guise of public goods and long term impact. There's an inherent rift there, right? So if you just want to drop $10 million to attract more users, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, look at the world of VCs and tech startups. Like, that is just a norm there. And it's not, I'm not trying to make a normative judgment on it. Just call it what it is. And then you have much more clearer comparables and approaches of what you want to do, right? If you actually want to have impact 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, you might be, or not might be, you are most definitely going down a very difficult and unclear path through a dark forest. And it's very hard to pull up above it and to know what is the thing that's going to get us there. And this is by no means a problem just in the Web3 space. Talking to folks in governments and traditional foundations and any kind of traditional funding body, including ones that are spending tens of billions of dollars a year, they haven't solved these problems. These are not easily solvable problems. So again, that's just where it's really important to be humble and be willing to kind of have these discussions publicly. And if you're interested in specifically allocation mechanism design and funding mechanisms, I suggest you hang around for the next panel. But also, Thursday, Iwaki is releasing his book on capital allocation mechanisms. There's the Mechanism Institute, which they have a great mechanism library. There's already so many great resources in this direction. And again, it's about more of us coming together and piecing these tools together so that we can do more. I think another big thing is also just thinking about feedback loops. I think that it's very easy to, you will likely get a survey after this event, right? It's very easy to just be like, hey, you did a thing, here's a survey, give us some quick responses or some feedback. And that is a form of it, right? That is a good place to start, as I'll touch on in a moment. But trying to really think about and develop some kind of feedback loop where, right, you have inputs, you have a process, you have outputs, and as part of that, you try to create a new input resulting from whatever just happened. And there's all kinds of different loops you could find online, different kind of graphics that break it down in different ways. But the end goal is figuring out, for whatever you're trying to do, what is this loop of pulling in the right voices and being challenged on what you've done to do better in the future. So again, that means being humble. That means recognizing that we can always do better. And it's this kind of continuous and iterative exercise of stakeholder mappings and how you actually connect and hear with all these different folks. And that can seem very open-ended and vague. And so, surveys is a very reasonable thing to do. In the context of these broader theories of change, how can you do stakeholder mappings that are not just my users, my team, my DAO, my foundation, etc., but really thinking, well, if we want to affect a certain change with a certain population down the line, how do we start getting their input? And they're probably not Web3 native, assuming you're actually being ambitious enough in a long-term basis. And trying to say that, like, oh, you have to start using MetaMask or understand private keys is just not a reasonable expectation for most humans on the planet. And so actually thinking about how can we build these bridges that aren't necessarily pushing to, but more contributing to and hearing from and genuinely listening will be very useful. And spend time doing one-on-ones with people in your community and like actually getting to know your grantees. In doing a lot of this research, I've candidly been a little shocked with how many grant programs are like, oh, we occasionally talk to someone. It's like, well, shouldn't you shoot for like actually getting to meet and develop deeper relationships with your grantees and want to support them to succeed, which is really one of the next topic. And I pulled this from just like, I think the engineering Wikipedia of just like what are different support structures. And one of the things I want to work on this year is kind of adopting this, right? Where the top are support types, allows movement in, redirects movement in. It's just this very specific type of, like if you're doing specific type of engineering support structures, what are your affordances? What are your allowances? What are the things that can happen? And so how do we apply that logic to grant programs? Right? If you actually dedicate overhead resources to have someone on the team who directly builds relationship with your grantees and does open office hours on a weekly basis, etc., that's going to allow you certain affordances then with your community and allow the potential for certain outcomes then. Same thing goes if you start developing an accelerator or different kinds of support structures. And so I know this is a topic that also comes up a lot and is one that we're very excited to dive into with more folks as well. And this is pulling a tweet from Milwaukee from, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And I think is a nice illustration of what a lot of people don't realize as being the invisible digital infrastructure that actually makes a lot of the things that we use possible at the end of the day. Right? Like most of the world, especially in terms of like enterprise and massive systems around the world, they run on Linux, which is all open source. And there's so many open source tools that are just at the core and backbone of our digital world and economy that we ignore. And so, as a first step, given that we are a digitally native community, we have to recognize the support of public goods in this kind of digital fashion. And this is just step one, right? Like nowhere in here are educational programs or research programs or supporting nature or anything that is more traditionally thought of as public goods. And so, again, challenging ourselves to really expand these definitions and to think about if you are a capital allocator in the space, right? Why don't we have creative residencies in Web3 that don't dictate the usage of Web3 tooling, right? Like, let's just get more literal literature and art campaigns and things that show the ethos of decentralization and communal ownership and coordination. And I think there are a few players, including Gitcoin, who are kind of not just doing memes on Twitter, but actually like building artifacts that people can interact with beyond. And more of us need to get inspired by that and think about how is that connected to your project or protocol and try to pick your subset of that you could also try to seed. And the last thing I'll end with is just this idea of sharing and coordinating more. It sounds so easy. I'm sure no matter where you went to school in the world, we all heard about these basic ethos back in kindergarten or some version of it. And right, it's just good to play with others, right? You don't want to always be doing things alone. And one of the challenges that I've personally noticed is that a lot of the topics, a lot of the core problems, whether it's impact measurement, whether it's building systems of support, people will publicly say, yes, we need to go do more and coordinate and collaborate. And then you actually pitch them of like, okay, great. Like, will you write about this publicly? And will you share about this publicly? It's like, oh, I don't want to be the first one. I don't want to set the trend. I don't want to accidentally get thrown on the bus and have some Twitter storm about how we did something wrong. And so there still is just this very human tendency to pretend that there are blocks in place. And I don't use the word pretend here lightly in the sense that it's meant to be diminishing the challenges and actually doing so. But these things can feel very personally and individually uncomfortable. It is, it is not easy being vulnerable in public. And so this is a version of that. And we all need to learn how to say that, hey, we don't know what we're doing. We're trying to do better. How do we actually share resources? How do we fund activities that will prop up all players and not just support one specific individual group or outcome? And how do we help each other move forward together? There's still a lot of things that are unclear in a lot of what I'm saying. And the hope is that with more of these kind of events where we have deep workshops and deep conversations, we can start getting at how to actually drive this forward. So with that, I think I've taken just about all of the time on my end. 2 minutes left? Okay, cool. So I guess maybe time for one question if anyone has one. Otherwise, we can bring up the panelists and transition to that. But yeah, anyone have a question?
How you got the Bitcoin tattoo?
Oh, this is not a tattoo though, as was evidenced by accidentally getting it. I know someone else who accidentally smudged their face after getting it yesterday. Gitcoin did a great event yesterday. Unfortunately, no way to go back in time for it, but yeah, it was just from that one. Okay, did you wanna?
Yeah, so on the kind of last slide, like what's a great, I guess, like upcoming use case or example that you're very excited about on sharing, coordinating more across grant programs?
Yeah, I mean, I know one thing that came up in some of the workshops yesterday at the Gitcoin event is talking about how have grant programs tried measuring impact and what are kind of literally incremental steps that can be taken from there. I think that would be a wonderful thing to share in public. I know the idea of like a dead DAO directory kind of came up as well. The idea of just how do we evidence and document the things that did not work. And that's not to say that, again, it was a failure and you did something wrong. It's just things don't work. And that's how we learn what does. So, yeah, I think these kinds of steps towards whatever chances are, whatever you want to see and learn about is a thing that we can all share about together. And so just finding the right groups of like who can shepherd that and do the work of actually putting it together. But yeah, I think especially on the impact side is one that I'm personally excited to push for. Cool. So with that, I think we'll take a minute to transition over to the panel.
Yeah, so thank you, Eugene.
Yeah,